really quickly. So welcome to Celebrating API Leadership in the City, our stories, our struggles, and our legacies. This presentation is brought to you by New York City Commission on Human Rights and WorkWell NYC. So I'll tell you just a little bit about WorkWell NYC. WorkWell NYC is your worksite wellness program. We're here to help you live well and work well. We are here for you with health and well-being resources, programs, and supports to help you move more through our virtual fitness classes, eat well through our chef-led cooking demonstrations, Be Well, which is us, Be Well. We're bringing you this discussion today. We're your mental health resiliency and mental health resiliency programming and take action to prevent disease. Some of their programming are the diabetes prevention, hypertension program, and BUILD. BUILD is our new initiative. It stands for Building Understanding, Inclusion, Learning, and Diversity. And their goal is to bring more attention to health equity. And so I will turn it over to Kadri to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayana. Good afternoon and welcome. The City Commission on Human Rights is excited to bring the celebration of API Heritage Month to all city employees in partnership with WorkWell. We are the city's civil rights arm, ensuring that people who live, work, or visit New York City are protected against discrimination and bias. Shortly, we will begin our dynamic conversation with our API identifying city leadership who have moved forward the agenda of equity and justice in our city. I will again shortly hand this over to my colleague, Momita Zaman, who will moderate the panel. And you also just heard from Ayana Mobonu of WorkWell NYC, who will come back to facilitate the Q&A part. If we were to read everyone's bios here, we would probably spend the next few hours doing so. So I will do a very quick highlight of the work of our distinguished panelists, especially during these times. When the city was in the epicenter of the pandemic, Commissioner Penny Abewardena of the Mayor's Office of International Affairs ensured that our partners through UN provided the much needed PPE for our city. Chief Actuary Chan, the key guardian of city's fiscal health, has kept pensions and other reserves solvent during this crisis. Commissioner Bill Chung of the Department of Youth and Community Development has been instrumental in supporting our young people and community-based organizations during these unprecedented times. Commissioner Dave Chokshi of Department of Health and Mental Hygiene took over leadership during the public health crisis and led the city towards healthy recovery. Commissioner Andel Castillo of the Mayor's Office of Media and Entertainment has been spearheading reopening of businesses and leading the recovery, including recent announcement of reopening of Broadway. Finally, Chair and Commissioner Carmelyn P. Morales, who I'm honored to call my boss, who has led the city in fighting discrimination, bias, and hate during this pandemic. We all know representation matters, and who we are in all our complex intersectional identities shape us who we turn out as leaders. This event is also an intentional celebration of all our API identifying public servants who serve the city selflessly day and night. Even in the midst of challenges, you were here. We see you and we thank you for the work you do. One final reminder, we will take questions from everyone in the chat, but please keep your questions for our leadership to the topic in hand today. However tempting it might be to ask a vaccination question to Dr. Chokshi, we urge you to refrain from it. Without further ado, Momita, please take on.
Thank you, Kadri. Echoing Kadri's sentiments, I'm really glad to be here with all of you to moderate this discussion. I'm the Director of Curriculum and Strategic Engagement at the New York City Commission on Human Rights. And it's so inspiring to see all of our, so many of our API leaders in government together today at this panel. So we want to just jump right into our questions. One of the first things that we wanted to really hear from our commissioners and chief actuary is, what does API Heritage Month mean to you? Why is it important to celebrate, and what makes you most proud of your heritage? We can start with Commissioner Dave Chucksey.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm just so honored and proud to be a part of this panel this afternoon. Thank you for organizing it. Thank you for having me be a part of it. And I'll extend that pride into my answer. You know, I've been thinking a lot about the reasons that heritage is important, because my parents are visiting after a long time during the pandemic when we weren't able to spend time together. And I'm so grateful that they're visiting at a time where they can really make up for some of the missed interaction with my daughter, who will turn 2 this weekend. And you know, it's in seeing them interact that I've reflected on how important my heritage is to myself, and how much it has shaped me, not just personally, but also professionally. And so briefly, you know, what I'll convey is that one of the things that I've realized has been shaped by my heritage, by my family, and the religious tradition that I grew up in, which was Jainism, is the notion of humility as strength. And I think it's something that we have turned to time and again during this crisis, to understand that that humility, and particularly humility of knowledge, humility in action, you know, humility in having empathy for one another, is a source of great strength, particularly in times of crisis like the one that we have been in.
Thank you, Commissioner. And maybe Commissioner Abby Wardina could follow up with her reflections.
Sure, and I won't ask Dave about vaccinations if no one asks me about diplomatic parking. Sorry, I had to throw that in there. You know, this month means quite a lot for me. So I was undocumented as a child, and didn't get a path to citizenship until I was a teenager. And ironically, it was thanks to Ronald Reagan's amnesty back in the mid 80s. And so I've always had like a complicated relationship about my heritage, being Sri Lankan and assimilating, trying to be American, and what is American and all of that. And, you know, these last 4 years after the Trump administration, I think many of us have quite a lot of PTSD. I want to just shout out your team at Human Rights, Carmelyn. What you all have been doing in the last year has been extraordinary, because we saw right after that China virus and all the other nonsense that was coming from the federal government, what was happening in our communities. And I partnered with many of you to, you know, work with the diplomatic corps, the consulates, and get out in these communities to ensure that we're not only driving economic engine there, but to ensure their safety and that they understand the rights that they have. So this is a particular momentous month, because we survived a lot. We're dealing with a lot of PTSD. And just for me personally, it's always that, you know, that hyphen, Sri Lankan American, American Sri Lankan, and my relationship with that. And this allows me a chance to really reflect on that.
Thank you, Commissioner. And really, I appreciate both of your reflections on this past year, being that it's been so unique for API communities, and reconnecting with family, and also thinking about your individual identities and your histories. So I'd like to pass it to Chief Actuary Chan to share her reflection.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I just want to echo some of the comments made that, you know, thank you for having me be a part of this panel. I'm very honored to be here with, you know, my colleagues around the city. And, you know, it's a great time to get together, you know, right now to just talk about everything that's going on in our city and in our world and in our communities. You know, what AAPI Heritage Month has meant to me in the past, I think has really evolved this year. You know, in the past, it was about, you know, you go to a lot of sometimes festivals, right, where you see lion dances and you eat, you know, different types of food, and you might be folding origami with the kids and participating in calligraphy and writing and all that. But I think, this year with the climate that's been going on in our community, it has really evolved into deeper discussions like this. And what does it really mean to be part of this community? And a lot of the history has come out. And I, for one, just learned that, why is May AAPI Heritage Month? I don't know if you guys know this or not, but it is because of the month when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed 152 years ago. And I guess shamefully for myself, I just realized that this year. And so there's a lot of history, I think, is a point that needs to be shared with, I think, not just those in our community, but our partners around the country too, to really understand our background, how we got here, and obviously that we belong to. Another fun fact is obviously the Chinese Exclusion Act, which wasn't repealed until the middle of last century. And if you think about that, very well, some of us around here on this call might have even been around during that time, or definitely have parents that have been around that time. So this is really, really recent history. And sometimes it still has a effect on how we're viewed in this country. And so I think, having the honor to speak on panels like this and to really elevate our voices and share our stories means a lot more to me this AAPI Heritage Month. So thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you for sharing that, and how history is so important, right? Especially understanding the relevance of this month and having that historical context in terms of API communities. So I think that to segue to Commissioner Chong to talk about your work at your agency and what API Heritage means to you. You're muted, Commissioner Chong.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, so my story is a little different. My parents came to this country from China in the 1940s, and there was no Chinatown to move to, so they moved to where they could afford. And so we lived in Brooklyn, Brownsville, Bensonhurst, and Midwood. And the thing that was common in all three neighborhoods in my childhood was we were the only Asian American family wherever we lived. So early on, I understood that we were different, but there was this tremendous pressure to feel like you belong or to fit in. And so I think this month means two things. One is it's okay to celebrate what makes us different, but also it affirms that we belong.
Thank you, beautifully put. And Commissioner Del Castillo?
Thank you. I want to echo what my other colleagues have said, that it's a real honor and privilege to be part of this panel. I'm so happy to see everyone. Just looking at the screen, it's this wonderful, rich tapestry of the AAPI community. It's really an honor to be part of it. So my background is, my mom is a nurse from the Philippines, but created a family out of her friend circle, which was pretty diverse and international, but primarily it was my godmother's family that I was close to, which was Irish. And so for most of my life, I was like celebrating St. Patrick's Day. And so to have a month to celebrate AAPI community is really, really important. And I think, like everyone said, especially this last year, it just means that much more to be able to celebrate not just the diversity of our nation's population, but the diversity of the AAPI community, and to really celebrate the contributions of the various groups to our history. I think I was 21 when I learned about the role of Filipino Americans in the labor movement. And so it's so important that we're able to acknowledge, recognize, and celebrate the contributions of the AAPI community in our country.
Thank you, Commissioner. And finally, Commissioner Morales.
Sure. I mean, well, actually, first of all, I want to just take a step back and say thank you to WorkWell for working with my team to put this together. I want to specifically also thank Mumita, who on my staff has been championing doing a panel like this to celebrate the API leaders in the city for quite a while. So I'm so glad that we're doing it, and I'm so glad that she is moderating that. So much of what my colleagues have said is also why I feel this month or celebrating this month is important. And just to kind of put us in the present, I also just want to say how much it's meant to me that especially in this past year, not only getting through the pandemic, but for many of us, for many of our colleagues, for many of our families, also getting through the rise in anti-Asian hate and scapegoating. It's been incredibly empowering and comforting for me to have so many API colleagues and leaders throughout the city. I know that Commissioner Chong is holding down the fort in his area. I know the same thing to be true for Commissioner Del Castillo and Commissioner Chucksy and all the other folks on this. I know that Commissioner Abby Ordina put so much time and effort in making sure that New York City got the PPE and supplies it needed when we needed it most. As we look back and celebrate the contributions in the past, I want us all also to reflect on how much API leadership now in our city have carried us through this crucial time, this time when so many of our communities have been in pain and struggling, not just API communities, but all of New York City. And just look at this program and the leadership that's been involved in bringing us through this. So I love that we celebrate the past, that we recognize the history. I love that we can recognize the moments of, why May, when Filipinos and Phil-Ams contributed and started coming into this country. But I also think it is crucial, especially now that we are having crucial conversations about what are the contributions of Asian American and Pacific Islanders to civil rights, to human rights, to all sorts of things, that we recognize what's going on right now, including all of the people on this panel. So again, thanks to everyone for joining us today.
Thank you, Commissioner Morales, and thank you all for your reflections on API Heritage. I know Commissioner Chucksy has to leave, but we'd like to pose one question to you before you go. And because this program is about empowering API city employees, we want to hear your reflections on what did you know at the early stage of your career, and what advice will you give to someone who is starting their career? What do you wish you knew when you began your work, and what advice would you give to someone who's in mid-career and looking for a change? So there's a lot of questions within that, but essentially, what advice would you give to API city employees as they are starting their career off, people who are new to the work that they're doing?
Well, thank you so much for that thoughtful question. And I really regret that I have to jump off early, because this is already such a rich conversation that I'm learning from. So I wish I could stay, but we have a vaccination event that I'm getting to. But I think the advice that I would convey is that early in one's career, or during one's training, we often spend so much of our time burnishing our credentials rather than nourishing our convictions. And I think that at least for me, is something that with the passage of time, you realize that you need your convictions far more than you need your credentials. And I'll say that is particularly true during a time of crisis, as we've been in over the past year. And so, for those who are earlier in their trajectory, do the things that will help you to nourish your convictions, whether it is spending time with people who challenge you, or spending time with people who shore you up in the ways that allow you to hold fast and keep a grip on your values. Read widely, and do the things that will allow you to clarify for yourself what your foremost convictions and values are, so that they guide you through the rest of your career.
Thank you, Commissioner. Nurturing your convictions, right? A really wonderful reflection on what folks can do as they're starting in their career. So thank you, Dr. Chucksy, for joining us today. And so I'd pass the same question to Chief Actuary Chan. What did you know early in your career that helped you to navigate your professional life?
Yeah, and so I approached this question with, it's kind of three different aspects of my background, right? And being the one in the city that helps secure the financial future for those in retirement, I guess my first piece of advice for those early or even in their career, mid-career right now, is to save money and to take advantage of the retirement vehicles that the city has to offer. And I say this with sincerity. I see some laughs amongst my co-panelists here, but the compounding effect of saving early is many like folds in return in your retirement, especially when you have a long career like 30 or 40 years. And just as simple as, foregoing that lunch out, that one day a week, just pack your lunch, save that $20. In a month, it could, easily be $50 or be $100. And, or maybe, forego that coffee, make that coffee at home and, save that a few dollars a day. And you'll be surprised, and even in months, especially how the market's doing right now, or even in just a few years, how fast your money will multiply. And that will have many rewards beneficial to you in your retirement. In New York City, in addition to the great retirement systems that we have that we can take advantage of, there's also 401k, 457, pre-tax, post-tax, and you can save in multiple of those vehicles. So definitely take advantage of that. I think my advice from the AAPI perspective, career advice from the AAPI perspective, is just, being part of a culture where, generally speaking, we are accepted to, listen to authority, not question authority, don't rock the boat and all that. I think in the professional space, we really need to kind of think about it from a different perspective, right? We have our cultural way of living, obviously, and I'm not telling anybody to scrub themselves clean of that at all. But I think in the professional setting, we should be aware that things like speaking up in a meeting, contributing, questioning things, not necessarily going against it, but just to question things. And, an element of self-promotion, I think is all necessary to advance in one's career. So I would say keep those in mind. And then lastly, in the spirit of obviously this sponsor of WorkWell NYC, I would say that self-care and, your own wellness and taking care of yourself is very important. So many times I've been told to, obviously you need to work hard to achieve great things, right? But, if taking that to an extreme can be detrimental to your own health and even to your career, because sometimes just taking that 5-minute mental break or taking a water break and being dehydrated, I'm definitely not the doctor here on this call, but, just stuff like that, getting your sleep, not skipping meals, the basic things, and just remember to take care of yourself. I think those will get you very far in your career.
Thank you for all that advice. Really, that resonates really deeply about learning to take advantage of the different opportunities that the city provides to city employees, and also, taking up space in the place where you work, right? Really showing up. So the next question is for Commissioner Chong. How and why did you choose this career path? What brought you to city government?
So, I often have the chance to talk to young people, and I tell them it's a trial and error. I mean, very few people know when they're 18 years old what they want to be. So I tell them they have to ask themselves 3 questions. What's your passion? What do you do well? And what will pay the rent? And when you find yes to all 3 questions, you've found your career path. And for me, it took me 3 tries. We put a lot of pressure on young people to make decisions early in life. So when you're in middle school, you have to decide what high school to go to. And how many people know what they want to do when they're in middle school? So when I was in middle school many years ago, the things that influenced me were The Landing on the Moon by Neil Armstrong and Star Trek on TV, the original Star Trek. And so somehow I got myself into Brooklyn Tech. I was the last class before the test was the only criteria. So I didn't do well on the test, I think. I kind of, not a good test taker, did well as a student, got into aeronautical engineering. And after a year of calculus, I decided aeronautical engineering was not my career path. And I discovered I enjoyed writing. And after college, I tried my hand as a journalist with community newspapers and ethnic newspapers. Couldn't pay the rent. And then finally, I volunteered with a community group in Chinatown called Asian Americans for Equality. It was a pretty grassroots, radical organization at the time. And they were looking for someone to write press releases. I said, I could do that and work with the media. And what I learned in that experience, in the 13 years I was part of the leadership of that organization, was the power of people organizing, as well as the limits of people organizing. And that they were fighting an attempt by City Hall to gentrify Chinatown with a rezoning of the community. And I realized to make long-term change, you needed to be part of government. So I volunteered on a couple of political campaigns, and somebody I supported won, the first Governor Cuomo, Mario Cuomo, in the 1980s. And I got a job at the State Division of Human Rights. And as they say, the rest is history.
Thank you for sharing that amazing history and really advice about how being open to different things, different opportunities that might come your way that you may not have considered originally. So our next question is for Commissioner Abby Wardena. What are you most proud of professionally and personally?
Well, I am very proud to be part of New York City's leadership and this crew right here. You know, I was appointed back in 2014. So I think a few of us are part of the original class from 2014. And I inherited an agency that had been around for quite a long time, but had been very reactive in terms of diplomatic incidents, the parking program I joked about. And this administration, and it is the true of what I know all of my colleagues have done, everybody has been entrepreneurial, has really focused on how government can work for our community, and the programs and the initiatives and the policies all reflect that. And I think I'm very, very proud to have been part of this moment in New York City history. Carmelyn did a beautiful job of sort of reflecting on how we all, you know, upheld New York City last year, worked with everyone and kept it functioning. And I think that speaks so much to the work that we had been doing pre-2020, but it set us up perfectly to pivot into the power that we showed up with when COVID hit us and we became the epicenter. So for my team specifically, I'm so excited about the work that we are doing around junior ambassadors. This is a partnership we have with Commissioner Chong, but New York City Junior Ambassadors ensures that kids in our most underserved communities have access to the UN, diplomats who learn about the Sustainable Development Goals, see how they're part of a global community of activation around issues related to climate change or gender equity, but then they're motivated to do things in their community and they are activating locally. And that's something that, you know, has been part of the legacy of this administration. We've also been able to really take what New York City has done on everything from, you know, managing and rebuilding within COVID to all of our incredible work around climate accountability, the divestment work, and how have we taken that into the global conversation, right? One of the things that was very important to me when I joined is I believe that government should work for its community. I knew that in this administration and my colleagues here and throughout city agencies all believed in that. So how could we take that work, that passion, what we have learned, and share it with the global community, given that New York is uniquely positioned. We host the largest diplomatic corps in the world. There is just no competition in that. But how are we using that on behalf of promoting policies that we believe in, but also showcasing New Yorkers? And so that is what I am, I think personally and professionally, very proud of, largely because they're so intertwined. And I survived raising a 4-year-old in COVID. So anybody with children, and I'm looking at you, we're proud of that too.
Surviving parenthood during this time is definitely an accomplishment, but also the reflection about that in New York City, you have such a reach, right? Just throughout the 5 boroughs, but also globally, that you can set the standard. And so this question I'd like to pose to also Commissioner Morales. What are you most proud of professionally and personally?
Mumita asked me this question, but she already knows a lot of what I'm going to say. And I think also, you know, as we are reaching the end of this administration, I've been saying this quite a bit lately. There's more time behind me than there is in front of me, and so I've also been very nostalgic and kind of the look back of everything that our team has been able to accomplish. I am so incredibly proud of the team at Human Rights that has come together. A lot of folks already know this story, but you know, my background, of course, is doing a lot of the work that we do at Human Rights. But as a practitioner, you know, I had been doing workers' rights, employment law for many years before coming into government. I had never filed one case at the Commission on Human Rights during that time. And largely that was because it just, you know, while the city human rights law had the reputation of being one of the most, you know, the strongest, most robust protections in the country, it just was not considered a very active or forceful venue to have cases. And so when, you know, when the mayor's team first approached me about taking this role, you know, they said, are you interested in talking to us about, you know, leading the Commission on Human Rights? And my response was, well, I've never ever filed anything there. So we'd have to talk about really redoing everything. And I'm obviously here, so they were into that idea. And I fast forward several years later. I am so proud that we are, you know, what we do as an agency is now considered, you know, a model in other human rights agencies across the country. When I came in, I set the bar pretty high for our staff. As folks on this call who are on staff know, you know, we said we wanted to be the preeminent human rights agency in the country. And I think, you know, I think I don't want to claim the mantle there, but I think if we're not, we're pretty high up there. I love that we do this work by being ourselves. Our staff bring 100% of their human experience to the work they do. In every interview I've been in, we've said to people, we want you to bring your 360 of who you are and your lived experience in the work that you do. We want to show New York City that government represents them, that government is them. We want folks to know on day one that we care about their communities and their human rights because they see their community at our agency. We've grown from a staff that speak 9 languages to a staff that speaks over 30 languages. And routinely, people talk to our folks and they understand how important the work is to each and every person. You know, and during this past period of pandemic, I think I look internally to see how close our staff is. For a lot of the people on our staff, their colleagues are also their chosen family, because there's such a belief, there's such a will to do the human rights work that we can. So, you know, in the past few years, when we've seen transgender people under attack, when there were over 22 anti-trans bills, you know, introduced around the country, we doubled down on those protections here in New York City. When we saw Me Too exploding virally, again, across the country and beyond, we said, we're going to do the city's first public hearings talking about gender inequality and sexual harassment since the 1970s. And we did that. When we saw our Muslim brothers and sisters and other folks being attacked by, you know, Muslim ban after Muslim ban, we said we're going to double down on the work in that area too. And recently, as we've seen both, you know, finally, the movement on for Black lives and people actually calling out anti-Blackness in all of its different areas, normalized and otherwise. And as we've seen rises in anti-Asian hate crimes and anti-Asian violence, we've also come together to address those in very public campaigns and with really strong enforcement work. So I think as the head of an agency, you feel very much like the parent of your agency itself, right? Because of what you're able to do and how much you believe in the work and how much you put into it. So I have to say, I'm just incredibly proud of the work that our team has been able to do together.
Thank you, Commissioner Morales, for highlighting all that incredible work. So our next question is for Commissioner Del Castillo. It's normal and it's expected that we will face barriers in our work life, right? So we want to hear from you a significant challenge that you may have experienced in your leadership along the way, and what did you do to overcome it?
So, I think it's interesting. I was thinking about this question because the obvious challenge in leadership right now has been leading during a pandemic. But it's been particularly challenging for slightly different reason, like listening to Carmel and Commissioner Morales and Commissioner Abiy-Wardena, they were appointed at the top of the administration. I was appointed in 2019. And granted, I had been at the agency as general counsel and then chief operating officer since 2014, but moving into that leadership role is a pretty significant change. And I knew it would be, but I didn't realize it was going to be further compounded by a pandemic in the middle of that. And so so just making the transition into the leadership role, I inherited an agency that had been around for a long time, but whose portfolio mushroomed in a pretty short amount of time. We went from just being the Film Commission and running NYC Media to now supporting all of the creative sectors, and then the home for the Office of Nightlife. And so transitioning from the role of chief operating officer and general counsel into this leadership role that was going to try to shape the agenda for this newly expanded portfolio was pretty challenging, and working with the staff to sort of reorganize how we were going to do that work. I have to say, I too am very proud of my staff. They have proven very resilient. Our portfolio has changed so much in 6 years. And then the pandemic just compounded that, because everything that shut down in the first days of the pandemic were in our portfolio: the restaurants, the theaters, film production, live performance. And so the staff was already sort of pivoting because of my new leadership role. But now we really had to pivot. Like I've often said, we went from cheerleader to crisis counselor overnight. And that's not something that anyone was prepared for, because when we started out, our portfolio was thriving. It's 150 billion in economic activity and 100,000, over 500,000 jobs for New Yorkers. And so we had all these plans about all this great stuff we were going to do to sort of push it to the next level. And now we were just trying to salvage it and, do what we could to keep those. And a lot of, so myself, I worked in almost every aspect of the portfolio that I'm running now. Like I've worked in hospitality, I've worked in theater, film, not music so much, television. And so I personally was also having a personal reaction to what was happening to my colleagues in industry. And there are a number of staff that had the same experience. So, we really had to make sure that the staff was okay. I mean, like everybody else for sure, but they were seeing the people in these professions that they had also come up in. And so there were just so many layers that we had to unpack. And so really working to make sure that they were okay, so that then we could then turn around and figure out how best to support these industries that really are, they're truly I have to say, they're the heart of New York City. It's what defines us as a global capital. That's, even if you say you're from the US and Oklahoma, the first question you'll get, usually if you're traveling abroad, is, have you been to Times Square? Have you been to Broadway? Right? It's like, that's how we define so much of not just our city, but of our nation. And so that, I think, has been probably the most significant challenge. The way that we've responded to that is by restructuring a bit. And again, like my team has been really resilient to be able to shift gears constantly and just be on deck to support these industries. And I think we've done a fairly decent job as film production has come back. We're starting to get complaints again about parking. Penny, you're not the only one with parking complaints. And Broadway's coming back, but it's it's definitely been a challenging time. And at the end of the day, I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. I feel like I'm exactly where I need to be.
Thank you, Commissioner. And that really resonates, that in times of crisis, that there's opportunity for growth, immense growth, and that, you know, supporting your team and managing as an API leader, I think is really inspiring for all of us that are on watching you all share your stories. Our next
Anita,
question.
can I just one
Sure.
thing? Sorry, because I forgot, and I really think it's important to say that. As a commissioner who was appointed in 2019, one of the other things that I needed to, that really helped me overcome the challenges were finding leaders who were modeling a style that I wanted to bring to the agency, and they're all on this call right now. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge and thank the crew on this call for really being such great mentors and colleagues and supporters throughout.
And that actually really gets us to the next question for Commissioner Abby Ordina, talking about mentorship, right? And why that's important. And the commissioner talked about a variety of different identities where people, API plus, right? If you're API plus LGBTQI, if you're API and you come from a minority faith community, or you don't see yourself in positions of leadership, why is mentorship so important? And do you have someone that you look to for support, for mentorship, and how do you see yourself paying it forward?
Mentorship is, I mean, it's critical. I think we know that, but I also want to expand that concept into just like having advisors and allies in your life. You can, you know, put whatever sort of term you want to it, but I think this goes back to what Dr. Choksi said earlier about the nourishing of yourself. So much of that, I think for me, comes from relationships that I have. And that has to, you know, and when you think about mentors in that sense, I think as you start out in your career and as you develop, you understand who gives you what kind of advice you need, you know, to go there, what kind of maybe emotional support or just frustration you can sort of bounce off with certain people. These don't have to necessarily be close friends. These should be, I think, colleagues, partners, you know, people that I have met over the last 15 years in my career. I sort of have organized in my mind as mentors for X, Y, and Z, right? And I think that's actually just been really important. It's hard to say that I've one mentor because I actually have an entire like slate of brilliant, kind, strategic men and women and people that I go to. It just depends on what. And I just want to be real clear about that, because so much of, I think, one's success as well as like personal satisfaction comes from quality relationships. And I think there's like this negative connotation, like you're a networking kind of person. You know, networking is such a bad connotation. I just don't think it's fair. I think it's how you network, right? You know, right away when you're interacting with somebody that's just hyper transactional, that's no fun. That's not going anywhere. And that person will never be a friend nor a mentor. But you know, when you connect with someone, when you show up in an authentic way of listening, they'll do the same. And I think that's been really important. I'm going to give one example, but Carmelyn, when did you join? Like 2015, right? So like early on, it was very important for me as a woman of color who's never worked in government before. I reached out to a handful of like the women POC commissioners, and I was like, hey, can we like start, you know, grabbing drinks? I would love to understand what you do more, but how you're navigating this space, right? So what I call Carmelyn a mentor or a friend, she's both. I couldn't have gotten through this, you know, last 6, now almost 7 years without her support and advice throughout that period. But I just want to give an example of how these relationships can occur, and that they don't necessarily need to fall into just a mentor package. It happens, I think, in so many ways.
Thank you.
Mumita, can I add something super quick on that? You know, similarly to what you know, Penny said, like I always think of, I have my own kind of board, and people on my board, some of them know they're on my board, and some of people that don't have no idea they're on my board. Some of them are older, some of them are younger, some of them are the same age, and such a mix of people. And certainly some of the folks that are on today's panel are also folks with permanent seats on the board. But, you know, people who challenge you, people who know you really well, people who ask you really uncomfortable questions, but then also people who you know are not going to challenge you and are just going to make you feel safe during all of this. I think it's so wonderful to just have the mix of all of that. But amen and yes to so much of what Penny said.
Thank you both for sharing your perspectives on mentorship and like looking for people who challenge you, but also nurture you, and throwing yourself out there and being able to ask for support, right? Even if you don't know them or you're meeting them for the first time, but if they align with you, that it's really important for API workers to look for mentorship throughout their career. So our next question is for Commissioner Chong, Commissioner Del Castillo, and Chief Actuary Chan. Kind of moving forward and looking back to this past year, but moving forward, how have the recent instances of API harassment and violence impacted you, either in your work or personally?
So let me start that, you know, I'm a native New Yorker, born and raised here, lived here most of my life. And I've never felt unsafe riding the subway during the day. During the bad days when crime was out of control, yes, riding the subway at night was always, you had to be careful, you had to be aware of your situation, but never in a situation where when I take the train into Manhattan from Forest Hills, where I have a doctor's appointment, do I have to constantly look behind my shoulder? And, you know, it's probably the reason why it took me a long time to get my vaccine shot, because my wife, even though I became eligible in early March, didn't want me to travel anywhere, even by Uber, to a place where I had never been. So I had to look for a location at a pharmacy in my neighborhood and got my shot in end of April and finished everything up. But that's how it personally affected me. I think as a former activist, you know, today being the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, and as someone who came of age in the 1970s during the Asian American civil rights movement, I learned that the Asian American community grew strength and was inspired by the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. And in many ways, there's a parallel to today's situation where, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement and the leaders in the anti-Asian hate crime movement have a lot in common. And they need to be strategic about building alliances and building coalitions to make systemic change. And that's, you know, I always a big believer, I tell my staff this, you need to be on the outside, you need to be on the inside if you want to make sustainable, positive change. And the big challenge I think that I faced when I was an activist, and it's still, I think, there today, is leaders have to be willing to speak out against bigotry in their own neighborhoods and in their own communities. Something that's easier said than done, but if the leaders of today can do that, I'm confident that we can make the transformative change that our country and our society needs.
Thank you, Commissioner Chong. Commissioner Del Castillo or Chief Actuary Chan?
You know, I have been having a similar experience. I also grew up in New York City, and I find myself looking around me more when I'm walking down the street, and it's really traumatizing. I mean, I don't know any other way to put it. And seeing the acts of violence that have been committed, not just against APIs, but also, yes, as we're on the first anniversary of George Floyd's death, like these acts of racist violence are really triggering because it's bringing back experiences I had as a kid, and it's really hard, you know. I mean, and I felt bad because initially I was just trying to make sense of like what I was experiencing, and I was not able to be there in the way that I would have wanted to for my staff, who I also knew was obviously experiencing this in their own way. And I realized that a significant amount of time, just days, but that's a lot when we're all confronting these acts of violence, had gone by before I'd said anything. And so I really had to be honest with my team and say, you know, it's just taken me a few days to process and figure out what I'm feeling and what I want to say. You know, as I've said, like I'm still like, I'm a little bit new to this role in some ways, and learning to use my voice. Like, I'm in charge of media and entertainment. I'm not in charge of human rights or international affairs. And so, you know, also trying to balance, like, how do I bring this into the conversation as a leader of that portfolio is a challenge, right? Because that's not typically what we're talking to them about, right? But it's important. And so I've really struggled with how to do that. But I think I've gradually found my voice through conversations with fellow commissioners and leaders of color in the administration, especially, have really helped me find a way to use my platform as a city leader, even if it's a slightly tangential, if you will. It's that, but what I realized too is it's not, right? Like how media portrayals are, how the news covers these incidents. And so it's all the more important that I use my voice in that space to express concern, frustration, outrage, to inspire the stakeholders that we're working with to really think about how they're shaping our images in media.
Thank you for both of your reflections. And Chief Actuary Chan.
Yeah, I would say, you know, this has been, you know, quite a learning experience myself, just observing everything that's going on in the community. And when I say community, it's the AAPI community. That's not just in New York City, but obviously around the country. And you read news reports, and it's around the world as well. And I experienced a lot of the same feelings that have already been brought up. And I call it a learning experience because until it really happens to one of your own, you really don't understand the raw feeling and emotions that it brings up. You know, so I felt, you know, obviously fear, like some other panelists on here too, and sadness to see that this is happening, and especially in 2021 when we think that we've made so much progress, but sometimes we realize we haven't. You know, frustration of just seeing this stuff repeatedly on the news and on the streets and hearing about it, that it just is, you know, so often I read enough is enough, but it's not enough apparently because it keeps happening. So there's that too. And there's this anger of how do we fix this? But I think, you know, the silver lining of it, or the glass half full version of these emotions, is that I feel empowered. I feel very empowered to do something, or I should say maybe motivation to do something. You know, things as simple as just reaching out to a friend, or, you know, writing. We're talking about how this brings up feelings of our past, and I found writing to be very therapeutic. And, you know, I'm finding a platform to hopefully share that to a broader audience through, you know, Medium or LinkedIn, to really let other people understand that they're not alone in this feeling. And being on panels like this, you know, which is part of my aware contributions. And I say that because part of this learning process about seeing what's going on in the community has really put into perspective of how I view these anti-Asian or other hate crimes of racism, which is that racism does not come in just one form. It spans everything from microaggression to murder, right? The microaggressions are, you know, comments that some people amongst your friends might make, or even at the workplace that people make, that they're not aware that it's hurting or damaging to you or your community. And, you know, there's an education level that needs to be, I think, done around that. But outside of microaggression, it can progress through to the, you know, physical attacks and the verbal attacks that we're seeing on the streets. And really, really escalated versions of racism is obviously the murders that, you know, unfortunately we saw in different parts of the country in the last few months. And thinking about how someone, when I say empowered and want to help, it's really motivated me to help. I think about what it means to give back and to donate or volunteer. And that also can come in different forms, in the sense that you can donate your time. You can obviously donate money. But I think, you know, especially, you know, people like us on this panel has a third way of donating. And that's like the platform that, you know, Anne has spoke about earlier, that, you know, people with this privilege, so to speak, to have a platform and to have this outreach and be invited to be on these panels. I think, we have a duty to use that voice and to educate people, to share our stories, to make sure that, we can do our part in fighting whatever end of the racism spectrum that we're able to give back to and help, and I feel that it's, educating people on, maybe microaggression or the workplace and trying to further DEI efforts and all that. So, that it's, and I wrap this up by saying, yes, it's been a learning experience. It still is a learning experience for me. It's still evolving, but I would say that it's the motivation and being able to just help and give back in this way. And hopefully, reaching an audience of 161 participants today, I can help make a difference in this world right now.
Thank you. I really appreciate all of you sharing your kind of really raw, honest reflections and thinking about how you're balancing both your personal reactions to what's happening while also managing your team and supporting them and moving different areas of the city forward. So that's really generous of you all to share your personal experiences and how you're impacted from things that even happen in childhood, right? Like talking about different microaggressions and how that builds up to the things that we're seeing now and what that might trigger. So thank you all three of you for sharing that. And that moves us to our next question for Commissioner Morales. What has your agency done to address API harassment and violence? And additionally, as others mentioned, along with the uptick in anti-Asian violence, we've witnessed widespread calls for addressing police brutality after the murder of George Floyd, and today happens to be the first anniversary of his death, an increase in faith-based discrimination from anti-Semitism to anti-Muslim racism. This past year, we saw an unprecedented number of murders in the trans community. So considering all of that, what does healing from trauma, racist violence, and the pandemic look like to you?
So thank you for Mamita for that question. That's obviously a very big question. I'm going to first start with, what I think we've seen in the past year. I think the benefit, the real benefit of having staff who bring 100% of themselves to the work, people like you, and Kadri and Flora, who's also on this call. But the great benefit of that is that there are relationships within community, so that very early on, where there is need or where there is, fear of something that is coming ahead, we are alerted to that as early as possible. And so I think back to, even January or February, even before the city became the epicenter of the pandemic, before that, when we started seeing some of our API business communities in distress, where because of a lot of the messaging coming from the federal government at that time and the scapegoating that was communicated in that messaging, we were already seeing ways in which our small businesses or our business communities were really suffering. And then in the course of the year, just, wanting to be there on the ground, bringing attention to the fact that it was scapegoating, calling it out for what it was, then it turned into discrimination and harassment. And while the types of discrimination and harassment we've heard about over the past year, while they're not new, and while different forms of that discrimination and harassment, I think probably all of the panelists today could probably conjure a story or two or many from childhood that speaks to a lot of the the different forms of anti-Asian racism that's behind that. We have seen an increase, and at the Commission on Human Rights over the past year, we saw a 7-fold increase of reporting of anti-Asian discrimination or harassment into the agency. So putting things together like our COVID-19 response unit to expedite our response to harassment at workplaces or at housing or places of public accommodation. So we could, expedite or facilitate over 200 of those things, without even having to file a complaint. The number of bystander intervention related trainings that we've had, not just in English, but in other languages, so that we are giving New Yorkers what they need. You know, New York City, I think at heart, is a city where we want to stand up for each other. We love the diversity that we have in our city, and New Yorkers do a lot to protect that diversity. And for so many people, you know, when they see acts of discrimination or harassment, not just against API folks, but against Black people or trans people or gay people, or Muslim folks or Jewish folks, they want to feel like they have the tools, you know, at hand to do something about that. We've done town halls with our other agency partners, some of whom, again, are on this call, to make sure that we're casting as wide a net as possible so people understand how to stop these types of situations, how to report them, how to document them. I'm going to take the moment and say, if anyone experiences any type of discrimination or harassment, please report it to the Commission on Human Rights. We do have civil law enforcement authority in these cases, but we also, a lot of the work that we do is about going into community, however you want to define that, a faith community, a school community, a neighborhood community, a borough community, to talk about human rights and what it really means to live with dignity and respect, and to make sure the people around you are able to do that too. So call us at 212-416-0197. Go to our website, www.nyc.gov/human-rights. Print out some of the posters or literature that we have, so that depending on what the issue is, whether it's about stopping Asian hate or standing up against anti-Blackness or what have you, you can also publicly and visibly show support for different communities. I think in New York City especially, we are at our best when we work together, when we are a united city, right? So many people talk about solidarity in action. What does that mean? That is what we've been seeing all around, where we've been seeing such diverse coalitions of people coming together to stand up for Black lives. That's why, you know, Cadman Plaza is always full. That's why it's always full in the Village. That's why it's always full near City Hall, as people are exercising their rights to stand up for different communities. I love that that Commissioner Chong brought up, you know, the history of Black and Asian solidarity and civil rights. It's such an important thing to remember, and it's such an important thing to recognize. I'm going to bring us here to the here and now. Like, when we see these rallies, when we see these protests, when we see these actions, but also when we see the coalitions of people coming together for the legislation, for the different crews that bring back, you know, whether it's our nightlife or the Broadway shows, all of these are incredibly diverse teams, incredibly diverse groups of New Yorkers coming to say, we will not stand for it. We won't stand for discrimination and harassment, and that we want New York City back, which means a diverse coalition, you know, solidarity in action of all of these different groups coming together.
Thank you, Commissioner. And so finally, our final question before we move into the Q&A, and this is for all of our panelists. Looking ahead, you know, thinking about all that you've done, and Commissioner Malala said there's more years behind than forward, but looking ahead in terms of your own legacy, how would you describe it? What is the legacy that you hope to leave behind? And this is for everyone, whoever would like to go first.
I'll go.
Commissioner Chong. Oh.
So, you know, as I finish up my tenure as commissioner and probably transition to my next chapter in life, which is probably not working, my wife tells me, and she's usually right about these things, that I'm lucky, because very few people can say their life has come full circle. So there are two things, I think, accomplishments that kind of bookend themselves. Early in my career, when I was part of this team of leaders at Asian Americans for Equality, along with people like Councilwoman Margaret Chin, we were able to transform this grassroots organization into a powerhouse institution that has probably the largest developer of affordable housing in the Asian community, at least on the East Coast. Probably the largest landlord in Chinatown, which is in itself a double-edged sword given its activist roots, and it's marking its, in 3 years, its 50th anniversary. So we went from protesting in the streets to making real change to improve the lives of people. Fast forward to my 16 years at DYCD, 3 years ago, we were able to transform this organization into a powerhouse institution that has probably the largest developer of affordable housing in the Asian community, at least on the East Coast. Probably the largest landlord in Chinatown, which is in itself a double-edged sword given its activist roots, and it's marking its, in 3 years, its 50th anniversary. So we 8 years as commissioner, and 8 years in the previous administration. And the agency's only been around 25 years. Created by all people, Rudy Giuliani. So as my friend, mentor once said, even a broken clock is right at least twice a day. As part of a team of leaders, we've transformed this small, process-focused agency whose main mission or whose main focus was to get money out the door into this mission-driven agency whose focus is to create opportunities to fight the effects of poverty and racism by employing what we've called a collective impact strategy. Because we're investing in usually the poor neighborhoods, working class communities, communities of color, but we're not maximizing the impact in the money we're spending. So those are my two accomplishments that kind of bookend my career.
Thank you. Commissioner Abe-Ordina?
I'm wrapping up my tenure too. I think similar to what Bill said, I'm very excited about the legacy that my team and I have built over the last 7 years, because what we inherited was a small team that focused primarily on diplomatic incidents and operational issues, all very important. But like a important conversation I had with the mayor during my recruitment process was, this just doesn't feel like a good use of taxpayer dollars. We host the largest diplomatic corps. There is an agency, there's space, there's staff, there's budget. We should be doing more. And what we've done over the last 7 years is create, and to a certain extent, irrespective of politics, we've created programs and initiatives that make sure that my agency works with all other agencies, that we've built bridges to the UN and through the Sustainable Development Goals and exchanging best practice beyond borders. All of that has been phenomenal, but also how we've activated the consulates in our community, right? Depending on country, our consular corps, we have 116 consulates, are incredibly important bridges to our immigrant communities. And so in the early years, through our Connecting Local to Global, we created a lot of programming in which we were ensuring that they knew about our resources and our services. IDNYC was one of our primary key important programs, along with Moya, was to ensure that the consular corps knew how to talk about IDNYC, knew the reasons that their community could be worried about getting an IDNYC card, and being able to address that. And I have to say that pivoted perfectly into when we ended up with our COVID situation last year. We had a lot of services we needed to communicate. Stay at home if you're sick at first, then test and trace, now vaccinate. All of that has been incredibly important to do with our consular corps in their community, in languages they feel comfortable in. And so I feel like the kinds of programs we've built over the last 7 years should be a legacy to how government can work well. It just took an administration, it took colleagues, it took leadership that wanted to be both entrepreneurial as well as that connecting into the community through partnerships, right? It's like none of us can, we all have important work to do to our direct constituents, but we can't do it well if we're not working with each other. And I will say of, all the commissioners on this panel, as well as all the commissioners around other city agents, we all partner and collaborate on things. And that, I think, is going to be the legacy of both this administration, but also of the work that we did, I think, quite well at International Affairs.
Wonderful, thank you. Chief Actuary Chan.
So legacy is something that I started thinking about, I would say, the first day, or maybe even the first day I stepped foot into my agency. And the reason behind that is my agency actually has a really rich history in the city of New York. Just last week, our agency celebrated our 105th anniversary. And in over a century, that this agency has been around, there were only 4 prior chief actuaries before me. And the first chief actuary worked 40 years. And, with him working 40 years and my immediate predecessor working 25 years, a quarter of a century, you can easily see why we've only had 4. The first chief actuary went on to start an international consulting firm that is still around right now, still thriving right now. And so you can see, each and every one of them had made big splashes in the profession that I am in. And, so I started thinking about legacy, the moment I stepped in, and because of these big shoes that I have to fill. As the actuary for the city of New York, I would say my legacy is just to, make sure that the pension is going to survive. One of the reasons why my agency has been around so long is because the police pension fund in a prior iteration in the mid 1800s was the first public pension system paying pension benefits to their beneficiaries and retirees at that time, having to do with disability benefits. And so with that rich history, and it makes sense because when you think about pensions, I spoke about earlier, start saving in your 20s. So this journey that starts in your 20s, like right after college, the first dollar that you start saving for your retirement. And if you're in the defined benefit plan, you're starting to accrue service for your pension benefit formula when you retire, right? So let's say you work, 30, 40 years and you retire in your 60s. And in your 60s, you're going to be in retirement. And it's not uncommon right now to see retirees living well past 100 years old. We have people in our data that are definitely past 100 years old. And fun fact, teachers out of all the public servants live the longest. And females do live longer than males, which teachers' population is 2/3 female. And so my point is, if we're roughly saying from age 20 to age 120, that's 100 years that you're saving money and spending down your retirement. And so the time frame of a pension plan needs to be very long, and the projections and the liabilities that you need to account for are very long-term numbers and projections. And so when we talk about legacy, my hope is that my work is going to produce a sustainable pension plan well into the future, so that the 20-year-olds right now that are starting right now is not going to have to worry about their financial future and their financial security many, many years down the road when I'm not even here. And that work is very important for today about making sure that the calculations are correct and accurate in the city, and other employers are putting in that money necessary to fund those future retirement benefits. So, and then, just as a leader, that's my legacy as an agency, as a leader. I hope to, just inspire people to achieve their own goals. Just that's, one of the sayings of being a leader is a good leader is going to, instill trust in that person, in that leader. But a great leader is one who's going to instill trust and confidence in those individuals themselves. And so that is one of my unsaid goals, and maybe more drilling down into it specifically is to be a role model to those in the AAPI community, so that they can themselves, have that confidence and achieve their own goals, and then give back themselves to the next generation after them to build further generations of leaders.
Thank you. And finally, Commissioner Del Castillo and Commissioner Morales, briefly, how would you describe your legacy?
So it feels a little presumptuous to talk about legacy after just 2 years in this seat. But on the other hand, I really do feel like we've been very successful in recentering New York City's creative community as the heart of New York City's identity. Really pushing the fact that that is what drives New York, that's what drives people to come to New York, that's what drives people to stay in New York, that's what drives so much of New York City's economy. And it's not just about, A-listers and Broadway, and not to dismiss any of those, but it's really an entire creative economy that does range from all of the sectors that we serve in our portfolio. I think showing the scope of New York City's creative community, that it's It's the small community organizations in the Bronx, just as much as it is sort of Broadway performances, that it's comedy clubs, that it's restaurants. So much of our most influential creative movements were born in New York City. Like we just broke ground on the Hip Hop Museum. Hip hop is going to turn 50 in 2023. And I can hardly think of another musical and cultural movement that has, you know, really influenced the international creative sector. But, you know, we also, our nightlife, New York City nightlife has given birth to so many incredible cultural movements. And so really helping New York and the world understand like what it means to be in the creative community and where that manifests, that is not just on stage, it's not just on screen, that it's in our businesses, in our bookshops, in our, you know, like really understanding how much of New York is driven by creativity. And I really hope that that is the legacy. You know, a few specific projects that I would point to, our small theater study showed the impact of that. Our freelancers hub, you know, the first city funded hub to serve freelancers, which make up so much of our creative community. And then certainly our collaboration with other city agencies to infuse their work or celebrate the work that they too are doing with creativity.
I'll be super quick, Mumita. I know you're time. You know, I think much more about like the legacy of the people who are here on staff at the agency at this particular point in time. Like internally, I know you know this, Mumita, but just for everyone else, like we talk about what a special time this has been in human rights. One, because of how under attack human rights had been, you know, on the federal level in the last few years, but also how important it was to have a strong, thriving agency doing this work locally. We've grown from a staff of 55 to a staff of, you know, 160. Our staff feel as comfortable, you know, facilitating a circle, you know, addressing anti-Blackness in the Bronx as they do talking about, you know, the obligations of businesses in Staten Island, as they do, you know, hosting an LGBTQ iftar in Manhattan. We have a diverse, really interested staff who I think live and breathe human rights. And I feel like this agency has been very accessible to the diversity of communities that we have across the city. I'm waiting to see and hear about all the wonderful things our current staff do in the future. We already have people who have moved on to do some incredible work. I tell all my staff, you know, in the future, at least give me an interview in the future when I come to them for a job, because, you know, they're all movers and shakers and doing fantastic stuff. So I think that's very much the legacy of this place.
Thank you. Thank you all for sharing your reflections, being really honest about your own trajectory in your work life, and sharing your personal reflections about what this year has meant for you. I really appreciate that you talked about like reimagining what city could look like, right? And like, that's how do you imagine a future without first really thinking about your passion and your commitment to the city and the way in which you've expanded your roles in your offices and supporting your team. So I've really loved moderating this conversation, and I want to pass it on to Ayana. Before I do, I want to just thank our API working group at the Commission, who really helped bring together this conversation a few years ago, and we've wanted to bring you all together. And I'm so glad that we were able to have this conversation today. And I look forward to this conversation leading to discussions within different agencies, different city offices where API workers are, and that they are able to find the inspiration from all of you, and that they're able to continue in their workplace and grow and continue to take on this leadership for the next generation. So I'll pass it to Ayana for our Q&A portion. Thank you all.
This has been such a dynamic conversation. I know that we have a little time left, so if we could get in one or two questions, that would be great. So the first question, whoever this speaks to, please do answer. How can white allies support our AIP colleagues during this time?
Maybe I'll start and then toss it over to anybody else that wants to add to it. I say that, in order to even have a campaign of like a hashtag we belong online on social media, like what does that really say? It's, to me, it means that, we need to prove that we belong. And part of that, I think, is sometimes in DEI discussions and in, racism or minority, right, discussions, the Asian community seems to be exempt from that, unfortunately. When we talk about, minority hiring or other aspects of diversity, Asians aren't included in that discussion. So I would say, for those who are in the position to set policies and influence policies, to just keep that in mind, that obviously, as statistics show and as our roots show, we are part of the minority, and we should be part of those DEI discussions too.
Thank you, Chief Actuary Chan. That leads us to another question. Are your agencies inclusive, meaning do they utilize civil service platform to employ individuals?
I mean, I can just jump in and say yes. We have incredibly diverse staff, including several folks who are in civil service positions. And I talked a little bit about the growth of our agency. Many of those positions are also civil service positions. I think at a place like Human Rights, having kind of both continuity of operations, but also just folks who understand the history of different community struggles is incredibly important. There's a richness, as we've been talking about a lot during this program, understanding the history of civil rights, human rights, or of communities, I think is essential as we move forward, so that we're not repeating prior mistakes, but we're also recognizing where there's goodness in different spaces. And far too often, I think it's very easy to just revert into, thinking that, because there's so many groups in New York City, that it's one group versus another, or looking at the ways in which sometimes media tends to have a zero-sum narrative. But there is so much, and there has been so much solidarity and action in the city. And so I think it's important that we have people who have been at our agencies and have been doing this work for a very long time to remind folks of that.
Well, thank you for that, Commissioner Morales. We have another question. How does this being the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's murder impact your thinking about violence against all people of color and anti-Semitic, and what we could or should do about it? Anyone?
Can I jump in? So one of the things we're working on is creating we've started a work group to figure out how we can make DYCD more of an anti-racist organization. So we've invested in professional development. We're looking at how we can better align the work we do. We already disproportionately invest our money in poor communities and communities of color, but how can we do it better? Because the next mayor, whoever he or she may be, will inherit a city that have greater poverty, greater inequity. And so the extent we can position DYCD to be part of the solution for the next mayor is important to us. And it's a way of continuing the work that we've started in the last 8 years, and a way of marking our 25th anniversary as this agency that, as I like to say, always punches above its weight class.
I'm just going to add quickly, I think, that's such an important question for the folks in this panel, but also for the folks who will stay in government beyond a change in administration, right? Particularly if you're thinking about the murder of George Floyd, you're talking about government involvement, right? State involvement in that murder. We all have to, anyone who's in a position in government, whether you are the agency head or you're somebody who is the barrier to somebody applying because of some form at some window. Everyone has the responsibility of thinking about their accountability for anything that is anti-Black or transphobic or anti-Semitic or anti-Asian. We all have to constantly interrogate our own policies and practices and interactions to make sure that we are truly being anti-racist in our approaches. And I think that what is exciting is that, in this, we have a June primary coming up, and there are some really important questions now that I think so many of the candidates are forced to answer that would never have come up just a few years ago. Some of the, the things that we would have considered radical in terms of reimagining safety in communities would never have come up just a few years ago. And now they are forced to come up. And I think anyone who's in government, we will be forced to be thinking about, how do we include that at our agency? How do we include that in our practices, in our leadership styles? So great question.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I think it's really encouraging to know that as leaders, you all are thinking about biases, not just for the organization in hiring, but it's something that we can all take away for ourselves to think about, just challenging ourselves and thinking about our own personal biases. We only have 3 minutes left, but I do see a question here. Structurally, for AAPI people, what has changed since the death of Vincent Chin? I'm not aware of this, but if anyone can speak to this.
Okay, I'm probably the only one who was around when Vincent Chin was murdered 39 years ago. I think the Asian community is more organized than it was in 1982 when Vincent Chin, a Chinese engineer, was murdered by two laid off auto workers in Detroit because they thought he was Japanese. He was beaten to death with a baseball bat, and there was no consequences. The two men paid a $3,000 fine and not 1 day in jail. I think today we see there are consequences. People are getting arrested. People are organizing. And the coalition now is not just Asians, but it's a multiracial response.
Well, with only 2 minutes left, I think it's, I just want to thank everyone for joining this call. I want to thank CCHR for inviting WorkWell to help to lead this conversation. It's been such a dynamic conversation, such a rich conversation. And I think we're definitely going to have this again. I know that it took a long time to get us here, but I think this is something that we would love to be able to continue throughout all the different cultures of and the diversity of New York City. I think this is something really awesome. So thank you so much for everyone. We do have a poll. We want to launch our poll to make sure that we learn from everyone what they felt about this program. And the last thing is that we have 2 events coming up. We have events all the time at WorkWell NYC. And our next event is on Thursday. It is the Return to Work, Navigating the Transition. And we're really looking forward to having a lively conversation. Our conversation will be framed about what's in our control and sharing best practices and sharing resources to help us in the transition. On June 6th, it's Sunday. We will be having Fit Fest in a park in Harlem. And it's a great opportunity for you to get out and see your coworkers and work out at the same time. It looks like lots of people are enjoying this conversation. So like I said, this is something that we definitely will do again. I just want to thank everyone for your time. Commissioners, you took the time out, quite a long length of time to join us and speak so transparently about your agencies and about the work that you're doing. We really are appreciative of you. And that's it. Well, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.